Please join us in witnessing these inspiring leaders in dialogue about their visions for systemic change.
So I'd like to start with how each of you got into public service.
My whole life inspired me to go into public service. I grew up in this community. I grew up literally raised in the recreation centers, the libraries, the schools, surrounded by adults who were determined to see us succeed whether we wanted to or not. And I also grew up sort of seeing a tale of two cities, a tale of two Americas, frankly, as the family of a teacher, my mother, and a police officer, my father. I would get pulled over by police officers and get that kind of driving while black experience. But then they'd find out who my father was, and they'd say, "Oh, no, I'm sorry, you go ahead." And in so many different ways, I experienced sort of two entirely different realities growing up. Through college, and certainly as I came back home as a young adult, starting my professional career. And as one of the things that became clear to me is that when we, from a public policy perspective, ignore, disengage, or otherwise just don't engage the voices and thoughts and perspectives of different communities in our city as we develop policy and funding, those communities get left behind. That our funding and our policy decisions end up really being weaponized to hurt the very people who we say that we're here to help in the first place. And so I think that's probably it, just seeing a number of ways in which the policies, in many places, well-intended policies that we put forward actually just did not serve the interests of the community that I'm from, my children, my parents, my family, the friends I grew up with, and feeling like we can do a whole lot better than that.
Mayor Tubbs, how about you?
Yeah, I think much like Mayor Carter, public service has always been personal for me. And I've never really imagined doing anything other than figuring out the best way to serve and be of service to folks. I think a lot of it comes just from upbringing. Grew up in the church, and a lot of time our pastor would preach about the idea of being a servant, that you're on this earth to serve. My grandmother, she led the convalescent ministry at the church, so every other Saturday from the time I was 5 to the time I was 15, I was at the convalescent homes, talking to elderly people, singing to elderly people, reading scripture with elderly people. Then we would go to food banks and pass out food, etc. So service was just so ingrained as part of DNA. And then I would say, much like Mayor Carter, in terms of growing up on the other side of the tracks, it's interesting because growing up, I didn't see really two sides. I just saw the side that was very disenfranchised and marginalized, and always remember being really upset and feeling that was fundamentally unfair. My father is still incarcerated. He's been incarcerated for the majority of my life. So it wasn't until I went to college and I saw that there was an other side with opportunity and resources and investments and I was like, oh my gosh, how do we make these things more equal? And then to make a longer story short, after my cousin was murdered during my junior year in college while I was interning in the White House working with mayors and councils, that made me really take a break, a pause, and reflect and think about the need to actually do something for my city that had raised me. So that's sort of why I decided to come back into Stockton in specificity. But even if I wasn't in Stockton, I've always been interested in being of public use and serving the public in some capacity.
Mayor Tubbs, you have said that Stockton has been structured for the outcomes we complain about. It's a pretty powerful statement, and one that I think many people are feeling in cities across the U.S. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us and help us understand what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think oftentimes people get upset, Stockton in specificity, they get upset when they see homelessness or when they see high rates of crime or they see children not going to college, etc. And those things we should be upset about. But I think the next step and what people often lack is how do we get there? That these things aren't acts of God, these aren't random coincidences. These are a result of policy decisions made and investments made in the way we have organized and structured our society in terms of our resources and institutions to reach these outcomes. So for example, in part the neighborhood I grew up in, it's literally 3 degrees hotter on average than the area I live in now, near the university. And not because that area was ordained by God to be hotter, but because the city has not planted enough trees in the south part of the city historically. That same south part of the city also have higher rates of asthma of young people because there's not as many trees and there's a lot more congestion because it's close to the freeway. So the air quality is worse there. The schools, there's 4 different school districts in Stockton, and the schools that serve the kids with the highest amounts of poverty and the highest amounts of trauma have the least qualified teachers, have the lowest per pupil spending, have the least active PTA. So I think I'm passionate about government because I see what we complain about, what we're upset about, what we protest about are in large part a result of decisions that have been made in terms of the laws and how we allocate resources. And I think for everything that government has created that's powerful, government can also create things that are better and produce outcomes that are more reflective of our values.
Appreciate that. Mayor Carter, Mayor Tubbs is speaking about what government can do. And I certainly appreciate the optimism. I think we are also living in a moment where many rightfully feel some measure of mistrust towards government. George Floyd's recent murder and Philando Castile's before that, and sadly too many others around the country, have highlighted the historically dysfunctional relationship between police and the communities they serve. Can you talk to us about what kind of impact the national discussion around police has had on your community, given how spotlighted you've been, and what needs to change about the way we view public safety?
Absolutely. In a word, everything needs to change about the way we view public safety. I appreciated the answer Mayor Tubbs just gave because it points out something that we have to acknowledge. The challenges that we face in St. Paul and in Stockton and everywhere in between are an outgrowth of the policies that we've created, of the investments that we've made and the investments that we haven't made. Public safety is a perfect example of that. We have bought into, for at least the last generation, if not beyond that, a frame of public safety that pretty much all starts after something terrible happens and someone calls 911. That's emergency response, and it's important, but public safety is about what happens before something bad happens. Public safety is about how we make the investments to reduce the likelihood that something bad will happen in the first place, and somebody will have to call 911 in the first place. At the core, these American policies that center around this promise that if we just build more police and prisons, if we just hire more police and build more prisons and hire tougher prosecutors, that our neighborhoods will be safer. That logic has failed us. It's failed us over and over and over again, yet we keep doubling down on that exact same logic. We know the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so if I was living in a different neighborhood, maybe if I was living in a different community, a different part of town, this wouldn't be so passionate for me. I wouldn't be so passionate about this. But I live on a block in which we hear shots fired. I grew up having cousins and family members of mine killed, classmates of ours die because of gunfire. And so for me, just saying, we're going to respond as soon as possible after something bad happens is just not enough. We have to think much more broadly. We have to connect our neighbors proactively to the type of supports, to the type of resources, to the type of networks, to the type of prosperity, and to just the opportunity to feel hopeful about their future so that we have fewer people in communities across our country acting out in desperation in the first place. This is connected directly to what Mayor Tubbs just said, because as we hear all of the desperation, in particular in the wake of the murder of George Floyd this summer, and I think it was Will Smith who said racism isn't new, it's just being filmed now, because my grandfather and his grandfather could tell you the stories of unarmed black men who were killed at the hands of law enforcement in America. We've seen it on tape over these last 10 years. And it certainly makes it very difficult to continue to build trust, continue to build rapport and credibility in these institutions that we keep seeing on video over and over and over. That doesn't serve our neighborhoods, and frankly, it doesn't serve our police officers well either. It doesn't serve communities across our country. It doesn't serve public safety outcomes. So our goal is to be outcome driven. Our goal is to be data driven, evidence based with regard to our approach to public safety. And frankly, for the first time in America, that's the goal that we're driving toward. It's going to require, and this connects exactly to what Mayor Tubbs just said, it's going to require a willingness to listen to and engage the people who have often been on the outside circles of our public safety conversation, to listen to them in a new way and craft public policy and public investments that serve their needs, not just seek to disenfranchise them to the corners of our society.
Just to follow up there, in your conversations with the police departments that you oversee, have you felt any receptivity to evolving as an organization to trying to be better servants of the public good?
Without a doubt. And here's the challenge. It's like everything, right? Trust that takes a lifetime to build can be broken in 7 minutes and 46 seconds, can be broken in a moment. And so, this work can never end. And that's not necessarily something that says every police officer is bad. Just like our own personal relationships, just like our own marriages, the work of building trust is never complete. I actually think our police department does a pretty good job. Our police chief always tells our officers, the 3 tests are: were your actions reasonable? Were they necessary? Were they done with respect? Our police chief, after George Floyd was murdered, called all of our officers and told them, if you see anything honorable in this video, bring me your badge today. And so we have law enforcement leaders around our country who know that they're not better off when they see those videos. Those videos make our officers here in St. Paul, even though George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, those videos make our officers in St. Paul, our officers in Stockton, less safe. Because when people look and say, I don't think I can trust this man just because this woman, just because they're in a badge, that doesn't serve them well at all either. So this is work that we have to do at an institutional level to make it clear that when an officer falls below our standards of expectation, that they'll be held accountable, and ensure our community that they'll see that transparency so that they can know that as an institution, this is one that we can trust together.
Thank you. Mayor Tubbs, you have a similar stance on policing. Since taking office, you've reduced homicides in your city by 40%. And in 2019, Stockton had the greatest decline of police shootings in California. How have you achieved this?
I'm blessed to work with who I consider the best police chief in this country. And I say that not because we agree on everything, but we're very values aligned, and we have a very clear orientation that the distrust that communities feel at the hands of law enforcement isn't a made-up feeling. And it isn't something that should be taken lightly, but it's actually rooted in very painful and difficult experiences. So on the officer-involved shooting front, since 2013, our police chief has led in having use of force listening tours, where he'll sit with families who have ever had a use of force incident, whether considered justified or not by Stockton PD, in their living rooms. And he listens to their stories, and he lets that inform kind of policy changes. In 2014, before the murder of Michael Brown, we decided to put body cameras on our officer as a response to what we were hearing in those sessions. We were one of the 6 communities nationally as part of the National Trust Initiative under President Obama. And of all the communities, we've seen the greatest increase in measured trust, meaning that we haven't arrived yet, but the things we're doing, being in constant dialogue with community, really apologizing for racism in the past, but also in present practices, making the necessary changes has really helped, and our police chief deserves a lot of credit. On our violence reduction work, to Mayor Carter's point, since I was a city council member, I've been obsessed with this idea that locking someone up after they shoot somebody and after someone's murdered is necessary but not sufficient, and it doesn't necessarily make us safer because the murder and the shooting still happened. So in 2014, as a council member, I worked with the police chief to create an Office of Violence Prevention, and in that office we've institutionalized a practice where, in layman's terms, I tell our folks that in Stockton we're going to give the less than 1% of our population, literally 200 guys who we know, because on average, they've been arrested 8 times, so we've had engagement with them. They've been arrested, they've been incarcerated. They're on probation and parole. They're also housing insecure and food insecure, etc. And we know that in addition to what our law enforcement does, the new approach has been, let's give them the same attention from community-based organizations, from resources, from cognitive behavioral therapy, from case managers, from jobs, as they get from law enforcement. And we've seen that although not 100% of people respond, a sizable amount respond to actual, real, tangible opportunity, and it's made our community safer. In addition to that, we brought in a program called Advanced Peace, which is a similar model. It's run from our community-based organizations, and it also gives the young men stipends to be part of this lifestyle change and to work as fellows whose job is to now reach out to their friends and their networks to continue to keep the peace. So again, we're not perfect, but I'm incredibly proud of the sustained reduction in homicide each of the last 3 years, because it shows that you can invest in, that you can be pro-opportunity and also pro-safety, and that investing in sort of opportunity is not anti-police. It actually makes our police job easier, so that are called to be everything to everybody.
Mayor Tubbs, you often speak about how government can provide pathways for citizens to live with dignity, and you've received national media attention for piloting a universal basic income program to guarantee an income floor for your community. Can you talk to us about this?
I think what I've realized in the past 3.5 years as mayor is that a big issue in what we're talking about, whether it's about police violence or structural violence or economic violence and scarcity, we're talking about the fact that we don't yet live in a country where everyone is treated with universal human dignity. And that's what the basic income pilot in Stockton and the work of the Mayors for Guaranteed Income is about. It's really upping the consciousness of our people to make us understand that we should live in a society that truly gives everyone, not gives because dignity is inherent, but values in response to the dignity that every single human being has. And a big part of that has to do with economic security. When you're anxious, when you're working all day, when you're an essential worker, putting your health on the line and still have to go to a food bank after work, that's a problem. So accordingly, in 2017, we announced that we're going to do a basic income pilot. That we're going to pilot giving people money as a floor. And not giving people money because they're deficient, but giving people money because as a society we can afford to do so. That poverty and economic scarcity is so expensive, and no one benefits from that. And I think there was just a RAND study that talked about how if you look at just the way wealth has been extracted from the bottom 90% to the top 1%, you will actually give everyone living in the bottom 9% of this country $1,000 a month, aka guaranteed income. So to answer your question, in Stockton, we've been piloting $500 a month with this idea that if you give people not just money, but the agency to make the right decisions for themselves and their family, they'll do so. And what we've seen for the past 20 months is that folks are using money the way you and I spend money. So they're spending on food, on necessities, on masks, on PPE, on staying home so that they don't go to work sick and infect other people, on being able to keep up with their bills as they wait for unemployment insurance, which isn't automatic, which still confuses me. So really, really proud of that work. And I think it's, again, rooted in this notion that I want to live in a city and I want to lead a city that recognizes a response to the dignity of all of our constituents.
Thank you. Mayor Carter, what got you interested in participating in a UBI pilot?
Mayor Tubbs did. I've been tracking Mayor Tubbs. I've been tracking this work for a really long time. Grew up like everyone else, reading the writings and teachings of Martin Luther King and seeing how he made those arguments really clearly, that eliminating poverty had to be kind of fist and glove with our work to eliminate racism in our country. You really still can't separate those two things. The fact, and you asked me why I got into politics in the first place, and maybe in a brief sentence, it's the fact that we still live in a world where we can predict a child's expected life outcomes more accurately based on her race and her zip code than we can based on her GPA. That should be unacceptable for all of us, and we can do much better as a country. We can do much better as a world than that. My father grew up in an economy in which if you wanted to sell cars or groceries or anything else in our neighborhood, you had to hire somebody and pay wages in that neighborhood. That's a healthy economy. But we all know that right now in this economy, especially in this pandemic economy, that's no longer the case. And it's messing up not just the livelihood and the lives of those families and the children that they're raising. It's messing up not just the ecosystem of low-income communities, but it's messing up our whole economy, because when we run out of consumers, then there will be no one else for those businesses, those thriving companies to sell to. And so this is something that's really important to me. We, like Mayor Tubbs said, have launched our local pilot here in St. Paul. It's the People's Prosperity Pilot. We named it PPP to show that we could do a PPP program that invests directly in low-income Americans and produce a powerful dividend for our communities. It's funny, not funny, it's ironic, I suppose, that people react to that with shock and awe. Here we are, 60 years into a war on poverty in America. And of the billions of dollars that we spend every year on our kind of poverty reduction industrial complex here, the notion of investing directly in low-income families, investing resources directly in low-income families still feels shocking and unusual. And, you know, one of the things I think that surprises people most is this unconditional nature of the cash transfer. We're selecting 150 families who will receive a $500 unconditional cash transfer for a period of 18 months. Unconditional means we're not saying you have to spend this on rent, or you have to spend this on childcare, or you have to spend this on food. We're saying to those families, we know that you know what's in the best interest of your children. We know that you know what your family needs. We know that what your family needs might be different than what some other family needs. And we know that what your family needs in October might be different than what your family needs in November. So instead of telling you that we in City Hall know what's best for you, we're going to tell you that we in City Hall believe in you. We believe in your family enough to know that you know how to make a decision that works for your family. It's important to me. When my oldest daughter was born, we were on WIC, Nutritional Supports for Women, Infants, and Children. And anybody who knows anything about that program knows that we were a family of 3, and we would walk out of the grocery store every 2 weeks with more cow's milk, more eggs, more cheese, more peanut butter than we could possibly consume. The problem is my daughter was born allergic to dairy, allergic to eggs, and allergic to peanuts. So we could get cow's milk more than we could drink in 2 weeks. But we couldn't get the soy milk that my daughter could actually consume. We could get all the peanut butter in the world, but not the almond butter that she could actually consume, and on and on and on. That's what happens when we approach policy from this like patronizingly parental perspective from City Hall and from the halls of government to say, you know, here's a resource, but you can only spend it on this, and you got to spend it on Tuesday between 11:30 and 11:45 while standing on one foot and with your card in the left hand. Like, that's the extent to which we patronize families, and in doing so, we are, again, weaponizing and weakening the very systems, the very resources that we're putting forward to help in the first place. We think there's a better way, and we're trying to show that right here in St. Paul.
Well, I really appreciate the leadership both of you are demonstrating on this. I think that, you know, simply beginning with respecting the dignity of people to be able to make decisions about what's best for them and their families, and finding poverty offensive and willing to take direct intervention to resolve it in your communities, at least in some measure, is honorable and really impressive. And I hope more mayors follow your lead on it. UBI programs are one way of creating economic equity. Mayor Carter, you mentioned, you know, you can tell the economic trajectory of a person based on their race and zip code. I know that in St. Paul, you've been working very hard on educational initiatives, particularly with younger children, to try to combat that sense of fate that people from certain zip codes or certain areas are saddled with. Can you give us an update on what those intervention programs are and how they're doing so far?
Oh, absolutely. I'm excited about this work. I believe wholeheartedly that when we bet on our families, when we bet on our children, when we bet on our local workers, when we bet on our local businesses and innovators, that always pays a dividend for us, that those bets literally always win. And so our goal is to use every aspect of city government to help our residents and businesses get ahead. I tell my team, we don't have any sort of back office functions. And so everybody in our team is responsible for helping us move a vision forward. So our Office of Technology and Communications, for example, they know that their job isn't just to keep our printers working in City Hall. Their job is to leverage technology to change the world for our residents and for our communities. In the same way, one of the things that we realized early was we have families in our city who money is working well for, and we have families in our city who money is working against. Meanwhile, we have a whole floor of finance professionals whose job it is to make money work well for the city. Now, that work has been assigned towards making the money work well for the city as an entity, but we wanted to take that knowledge, that expertise, that experience, and point it towards helping us make money work better for our community members. And so we created, in my first year in office, an Office of Financial Empowerment, whose job is simply that, to help us make money work better for community members in our city. So the guaranteed income work that we are doing goes into a body of work that includes new rental supports for low-income families with children in our communities. That goes into helping, free tax preparation, because we know that, a number of the families nationwide who qualify for federal and state tax rebates never file their taxes. They don't think they made enough. They don't know, and so they miss out on their earned income tax credits and a whole host of state level credits. Here in Minnesota, it's called the Working Families Credit. We did some back of the napkin math and realized that our lowest income families are missing out on somewhere in the neighborhood of like $15 million a year in federal tax returns and state tax benefits that they're already entitled to. So we want to help them kind of claim those resources that are literally already theirs in the first place. The centerpiece of all this work for us is a program called College Bound St. Paul. We created an initiative to invest $50 to start every child born in our city with $50 in a college savings account at birth. Now, I was saying this at a local comedy show, like kind of roast thing recently, and the host went, $50 for college, huh? That might not be enough. And everybody laughed. But here's the thing. Research shows that children from low and moderate income families who literally have a few dollars, less than $500 set aside for college when they graduate from high school, are 3 times more likely to go to college. And when they do, they're 4 times more likely to graduate. It's not about the amounts of money. It's about the powerful message that we send to our children when we say, we believe in you enough to invest in you. So while we know that that $50 won't pay for a semester of college, it might not pay for a single credit for some of our young people, what I think we're experiencing is it is enough to sort of, take children for whom a high school graduation looks like a finish line and sort of just turn on that next street light beyond high school graduation and get them to start early, casting their imagination beyond high school graduation in a way that pays dividends for our community. We're excited about this work. Our community members are responding very well, and it's a new body of work that is swiftly paying dividends for our community.
When I speak with folks and when we were preparing for this series, what you hear over and over is that the change we need as a society seems so critical and so urgent as to be existential, and yet the government is often this slow-moving mechanism, right? We have the energy on the streets, but government can only move so fast. And I guess I'd just be curious how each of you as leaders manages that, because you're also the executives of your city, and I imagine that you're also expect to have some amount of interface with your governors, and people are asking you, why isn't this moving faster? And I'm just curious, because it's a question about leadership, really, that I think a lot of executives are facing also, of wanting to be a part of the solution and yet needing to deal with the realities of the process. I just would be curious how each of you manages that on a day-to-day basis.
When I first got into government as a councilman, I would just be so frustrated with how slow everything went. It used to drive me crazy. But now, as a little bit more experienced elected leader, I don't agree with, but I can appreciate why government moves slow, and this is why. Government's the only thing that touches everyone at scale. So you don't want to be too experimental, because it's the most marginalized, the most vulnerable people who actually rely on government services the most. They can't opt out to private things. So everything that's public touches everyone, but especially the most vulnerable. And I do think there has to be some degree of caution in terms of how things are rolled out, etc. And then the last thing I would say is that it's just always knowing that it's going to be slow. So I just push my staff to go faster, because they'll never reach sort of where I want it to be. Especially because I have ADD, so I went it yesterday. But as long as I'm pushing and pushing and pushing, I recognize I'm not going to get as fast as I want, that the public won't get as fast as it won't, but it'll be a whole lot faster than it would be if I just let the system do its thing without my interference.
And that's what I was going to say, Mayor Tubbs, is like your perspective of fast and slow is probably different than other people's. I would point to Stockton, and frankly, I'd point to St. Paul as a powerful counterpoint against the notion that government moves at the speed of molasses, right? I mean, you to be able to say the things that you've done in Stockton, you haven't really been the mayor that long to be able to list all of those things. We're proud of our administration. I'm towards the end of my first term in office, and we've raised the minimum wage. We've eliminated late fines in our library. We've completely rewritten our police department's use of force policies. We have literally fundamentally changed the business model for pretty much every one of our city departments. My theory is because a mayor like you, Mayor Tubbs, who grew up, like you said, experiencing the other side of the tracks, your risk calculus is different. Our risk calculus is different. You know, I've had folks who, in the context of our basic income trial, have warned me about the impacts on my political capital and on the impacts of all of these other kinds of things. And, you know, for me, to not do something like that, to not provide critical help in a pandemic when families need it more than ever, wouldn't be worth being the mayor. To not rethink public safety in a way that helps us get on the front end and reduce the amount of shootings that happen in our community, not just respond as fast as possible after someone dies, to not be able to do that wouldn't be worth being the mayor. So I think a part of this is about our appetite for risk. And Mayor Tubbs, I think I appreciate what you just said about this point that, like, when we do something in government, it takes, and it's permanent, and it's there, and it impacts everyone at the same time. That's why things like the pilots that we're doing around UBI, guaranteed income, are important, because it helps us to understand what the impacts are of these policies. But also, we shouldn't be patient. We should not be patient about the fact that children are dying in our community. We should not be patient about the fact that we're losing black men at the hands of unarmed black men and women at the hands of law enforcement. We should not be patient about the fact that our economy is being messed up over and over and over again. Lives are being ruined. Families are being torn apart by the inequities and the disparities in our community. We should not be patient with those things. We should not be resigned to sort of slowly bending the arc of the moral universe over the course of the next few generations. We have to do our homework. We have to look before we leap. We have to measure twice and cut once, all of those kind of statements. But we also have to lead. We have to be willing to take some amount of risk, and we have to be willing to chart bold new courses where they are very obviously needed. And that's something I see in your administration, Mayor Tubbs, and it's something that we try to emulate as well.
We already have written down on paper what a perfect union looks like. It's just a matter of making it reality. So it's not like we have to go back and recreate and redraw. It's literally looking at the parchment paper that speaks to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, looking at the pledge that talks about liberty and justice for all, and making it real, because there are aspects of the American experience that are a more perfect union. When you think of the neighborhoods that we all aspire to live in, or that some of us may live in, that have good schools, grocery stores, they're clean, they're safe, they're walkable, etc., where we can afford childcare for our children, where our children have the ability to be in activities where they're trained by a highly qualified teacher, when we're treated equally by law enforcement, when we go apply for a loan at a bank, we have no fear of being discriminated against because of our name or what we look like, that we'll get the same loan that anyone else would get based off circumstances and finances, etc. So there's models of that. Particularly for certain groups in this country. And I think the challenge for us is, if we want to marshal the political will and the courage to, number one, recognize that the myth of America in terms of this meritocracy isn't true for the majority of Americans, A, and hasn't been historically, and B, to actually put in action what we've said we believe on paper and what we pledge to do every day from the time we're 5 to 17.
Wow. We should not be patient. Those words are ringing in my ears right now. We are truly honored that Mayor Tubbs and Mayor Carter joined us